Well, hello. And again, welcome to our online confirmation here. Today we're going to talk about Joseph. You know, this session that we have here is kind of a two-parter. It's called There and Back Again. And if you remember the story of Jesus. That Jesus was arrested during Passover. So when we celebrate communion, we are remembering the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples. And that was a Passover meal. Well, the Passover tradition goes back to this story of Joseph and then later Moses. Passover really entails the story of Moses, but it's about the Israelites' escape from Egypt. So we have to learn how they got to Egypt in the first place. And that story is Joseph's story. Now remember, last time we talked about Abraham and Sarah. And then we talked about Jacob and of course his story with his two wives, Leah and Rachel, and their two servants, and all the kids that Jacob had, and how one night he was wrestling with God next to a stream. God kicked him in the hip in order to win the fight. So he had to limp for the rest of his day, but God changed his name to Israel, to one who struggles with God. Joseph is the son of Jacob and Rachel. Rachel was the wife that Jacob first loved before he got tricked into marrying Leah first. And Rachel, of course, had two sons. She had Joseph, and then she had Benjamin, and she died in childbirth, bearing Benjamin. And so here we are with the story of Joseph, and that begins with Joseph being 17 years old. So we begin in chapter 37 of the book of Genesis. So we are still in the first book of the Bible. This great sweeping saga that we have in Genesis that begins, like I always say, it begins with God's relationship with us, but it begins with God's relationship by creating the world. And so we have these themes of God's creating the world, and then of creating people, and then of the first sin and the first murder. And we get to the flood, which is kind of a restart, a reboot, before we narrow it down to Abraham and Abraham's family. And Abraham was the one that received the blessing from God, the promise from God that he would be a blessing to the nations. And he would be the father of a nation of many people. Well, we haven't gotten to the many people yet. What we got to is Jacob and his 12 sons and his one daughter. And we didn't cover her story. It is there, buried within the story of Abraham. But we're going to focus on Joseph now. So Joseph, because he was Rachel's son, he was Jacob's favorite. And again, it seems like every story that we have in the Bible, there's some type of sibling rivalry. And this is sibling rivalry really gone wrong. So, even though Joseph was one of the younger ones, he was his dad's favorite. Think about your brothers and sisters. Is there a favorite? Does mom or dad treat one or the other differently than everyone else? They favor them. Like as parents, we always try to say we treat We don't treat our kids the same. We love them the same. But we treat them according to your personalities. But we say we love them equally. But people have favorites. Joseph was the favorite. In fact, his dad made him a long robe with sleeves, and it had different colors in it. Now, back in that time, it cost money to dye wool to make these different colors. And so his dad spent a little bit extra money here on Joseph's gift and Joseph's robe than he did on the rest of his kids. As you can see, he was the favorite. And I should mention this story. I mean, it's a fascinating story, and they even made a musical out of it. You might have seen it. Maybe some of you even performed it. But, Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. But Joseph in the coat of many colors. And the other thing about Joseph is that he had dreams. He had dreams from God. And of course, being Daddy's favorite, he used that to his advantage. It says here at the very beginning, as we talk about him, his brothers didn't like him. Well, one reason they didn't like him is because he was a tattletale. He would tell on his brothers. Let Dad know what was going on out in the fields. So they didn't like him about that. And then he had this dream, and he tells it to his brothers. He says, hey, we were out working the field. It was harvest time. We're cutting the wheat down. We're bundling the sheaves. Then all of a sudden, my sheaves stood up. And all of yours bowed down to mine. In essence, he was telling his brothers, I had this dream, and in this dream it said, all of you guys are going to bow down to me. I'm Daddy's favorite. I'm going to get it all. And you're going to all work for me. Of course, they didn't like that. They didn't like that at all. And then he had another dream that he told his brothers and he told his dad, and it said, remember that dream about the sheaves? Well, here's another one. And in this one, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And his dad kind of yelled at him and said, what are you saying that your mom and I and all your brothers are going to bow down to you? So he yelled at him for telling that dream or telling that lie. But the brothers, they were mad. And they were jealous. But they were also careful not to do anything that their dad could see. So one time, the brothers were out. They were watching the flock, the sheep, the goats, the cows. And Joseph was sent to check up on them. So Joseph did. And of course, when he got to where they were supposed to be, they weren't there. And then he asked somebody, he said, hey, did you see where my brothers went? And they said, yeah, they went over that way. So he went over there. And as he was coming, because he had that coat of many colors, his brothers saw him. They knew who he was. And they're like, there's that Joseph. What should we do to him? How about we kill him? And Reuben, the oldest, is like, no, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him into one of these pits. Because they were digging wells, and so they had some dry wells there, so they had some pits. And we'll just say that a wild animal ate them. And Reuben, the oldest, said, yeah. But in the back of his mind, what he wanted to do is he wanted to go back at night and help him get out of the pit so he can bring him to his dad and maybe be a savior and earn some points. But when Joseph got there, they grabbed a hold of Joseph and they ripped his coat and they threw him into the pit. Then they sat down to eat. At least that's what the Bible says. It was lunchtime. So they're eating lunch. As they're eating lunch, this caravan of Ishmaelites. Now you remember Abraham had 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Well, these were descendants of Ishmael. Anyway, they were traders. And they happened to be trading and moving on their path from Canaan over to Egypt. And then Judah, can't remember where he is in the line, 3rd, 4th, somewhere in there. He says, hey, why don't we sell Joseph? We'll sell him to these Ishmaelites. They can take him to Egypt and sell him wherever, whatever they want to do with him. And then we'll just keep his coat and we'll kill one of these lambs here and we'll cover the coat in blood. We'll bring it back to Dad and say, hey, this is what we found. Is this Joseph's? And so that's what they did. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. Now you remember Judas? Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. So there's some connection here. But anyway, they sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver, and they took the robe back to their dad, back to Jacob, and he cried. He said the wild animal has eaten him. He's probably scattered all over the place, and so he started to grieve for his lost son. Meanwhile, the Ishmaelites made it to Egypt with Joseph, and they sold him to a guy named Potiphar, who was a captain of the guard. So he was a captain in Pharaoh's army. Now here's where we take a turn. So now Joseph's in Egypt, everyone else still back in Canaan. Brothers are happy. They got rid of this pesky little brother that they didn't like. Hopefully things go back to normal. Hopefully things can turn for the better. Meanwhile, Joseph, he's in Egypt, and the captain of the guard, this Potiphar, notices Joseph. He puts him in charge of some stuff. He sees him working, that he works good. He's a diligent worker. Whatever he does well, and it's a success. And so he puts him in charge of bigger and bigger things, and it always shines good on Potiphar because Joseph does a very good job. So eventually, he puts him in charge of his whole household. So he's managing Potiphar's household, taking care of everything that goes on there, all of his business, while Potiphar's off being the captain of the guard, captain of Pharaoh's army. Things are going along good, right? And it says there that Joseph was handsome. He was a good-looking guy. And after a while, Potiphar's wife starts noticing him. Her husband's gone all the time. She decides, hey, we got this slave. He's the manager of our property. He's good-looking. Maybe we can do a little something. So she goes ahead and she calls him in and tries to seduce Joseph, and Joseph says, no, not going there. Not going to happen. Not going to do it. That made her mad. So one day while he was in his office working and there's nobody else around, she goes in there and pretty much just forces with him, saying, "Come on, sleep with me." And he had, you know, he's trying to push her away. He must have had a scarf or something. Anyway, she twirled around and it came off and it was in his hand, and he freaks and he runs outside, and then she calls out to the rest of the household. She's calling rape and screaming, and everyone else comes in and they see him with her scarf or whatever he's got a hold of. So whatever he says, because he's the slave, even though he's the manager, it doesn't count. That the wife, the lady of the house, her word is power. Her word is stronger. Wait a minute. I got that wrong. She had somehow managed to grab a hold of his robe, pull it off of him. So he's outside naked. He's outside naked trying to hide, trying to deny this story. It doesn't work out at all. So he gets tossed into prison. And of course, in your prison, you know, you're kind of there for life. But he did the same thing when he was in prison. You know, you're kind of, you know, I'm not sure how the prisons were back then, whether it was a deep pit or there's, you know, it wasn't good. But he worked. He worked at being nice to the jailer, helping the jailer out, making sure that the jailer's job wasn't too hard. At some point, two people that served Pharaoh, says his cupbearer and his baker, they offended Pharaoh. They were tossed in prison with Joseph. And so they were all there. And Joseph took care of them. You know, he was told to wait on them, take care of them. And one night, you know, these guys had a dream. And they're talking about their dream. And in the morning when Joseph saw them, they you know, they're saying, "We had this dream, but we don't know what they mean." So the cupbearer says, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out, and the clusters ripened into grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into the cup and gave the cup to Pharaoh." And Joseph says, "Well, this is an easy dream." He says, "In 3 days, the Pharaoh's going to lift up your head and restore you back to your office. Your punishment's been paid, and you will return to your old job." And he says, "But remember me when you get to that job. You know, remember all the good things that I've done for you." And tells a little bit about his story. Well, when the baker heard this interpretation, he was, and that it was good, he says to Joseph, "Well, here's my dream. That there were 3 cake baskets on my head. And in the top one, there's all sorts of this baked food for pharaohs, but the birds were eating out of it." And Joseph said, "Well, this one says that the 3 baskets again are 3 days. And in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to take your head from you and hang you on a pole, and the birds will eat their flesh from you." So in essence, the baker is going to get his head cut off. Ouch. Well, 3 days after these dreams, it was the Pharaoh's birthday, and he did what Joseph said would happen. The cupbearer was restored to his position, and the baker wasn't. Time goes on. Joseph is still in jail. The Pharaoh, 2 years later, he has a dream. He has a dream that this is chapter 41. He says he's standing by the Nile, and out of the Nile, out of the river, come these 7 sleek and fat cows, and they graze in the grass. And then 7 more cows come out, ugly and thin, and they eat the 7 fat cows. And he woke up. That dream woke him up. Then he fell back asleep, and he had a second dream. This time it was about ears of grain that grew on one stalk, and there were 7 ears, and they were good, they were plump. And then there were 7 ears that were thin and blighted by the east wind, but the thin ears swallowed up the 7 full ears. And he woke up and he remembered that dream. So in the morning, he's thinking about these dreams. He's troubled by them. They were similar. He didn't know what they were about. He calls his magicians in. They can't interpret it for him. Meanwhile, the chief cupbearer hears Pharaoh, as he's giving him his wine, he hears Pharaoh telling his dreams to these magicians who can't decipher what they mean. And he says, hey, wait a minute, I remember when I was in jail, there was a guy there that heard my dream and he knew what it meant. So the Pharaoh sent for Joseph. They take Joseph out of prison, they clean him up, they bring him before the Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, I hear you can interpret dreams. And Joseph says, well, not I, but God knows what they mean, and God tells me. So Pharaoh tells him his dreams. And Joseph says, well, it's the same dream. You know, you're being forewarned. You're going to have 7 good years of harvest, followed by 7 lean years. And the 7 years of famine are going to, you know, they're going to eat up all, after the good years, they're just going to eat up all the food that you have. They'll destroy your nation. And Pharaoh's like, what should I do about it? Joseph says, choose somebody. Somebody that you know who is wise. Somebody who you know that you can trust. Set them over the land of Egypt to manage your crops. Take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during these 7 good years and put it away. Stockpile it. Put it under your authority for food in the cities. And then after the 7 years, when the 7 years of famine come, then you will have food to feed the nation. They won't starve. And of course, Pharaoh says, well, since God is talking to you and God has told you all these things, I'm going to put you in charge. So he put Joseph in charge of this project. And that's what Joseph did. He stored up a lot of grain, got it ready, because when the years of famine came, there was going to be a lot of starvation in the land. Meanwhile, while Joseph's in Pharaoh's favor and through these 7 years while storing things up, he ends up getting married, and he has a couple of kids, Manasseh and Ephraim. So later on, when we get to the 12 tribes of Israel, and you list them, when you look through that list, you never see a tribe of Joseph. We always see a half tribe of Manasseh and the half tribe of Ephraim. What that means is that the half tribe of Manasseh and the half tribe of Ephraim together, they make up the tribe of Joseph. But Joseph gets a little special attention here again because of what he's done. So now remember, he's the manager of the produce of the land. He's got all the grains in silos. He's got them put up in bins. He's got stored up. And when the famine hits Egypt, it doesn't hit just only Egypt, but it hits the whole area. And it even hits the land of Canaan, where Jacob and all of Joseph's brothers are there. So eventually, they hear that there is food in Egypt. So Jacob, he has to tell his sons, he says, you go to Egypt, buy some grain, bring it back. He sent everybody but the youngest son, Benjamin, because he didn't want Benjamin to get hurt. Benjamin was the last, son of Rachel. He thought that Joseph was dead, and so he wanted Benjamin is now the favorite. So when the brothers come and they see the governor who's over, the manager who's over all the grain, they come and what do? Oh yeah, they bow down in front of Joseph. They don't recognize him. I mean, he's dressed like an Egyptian. He's got an Egyptian haircut. He's got the Egyptian makeup on. They don't recognize him. But Joseph recognized his brothers. And he treated them like strangers. It says, chapter 42. He spoke harshly to them. Ask where they come from. Ask what they want. And he remembers his dreams from when he was a teenager. And he accuses them of being spies. They're like, no, we're not spies. We just come to buy food. We're all sons of one man. We're brothers. We're honest men. It says, we, your servants, are 12 brothers, the son of a man in Canaan. But the youngest, he didn't come with us. He stayed back home with Dad. And Joseph says, well, I don't believe you. I think you are spies. And he says, you shouldn't leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. So one of you go and bring him back, while the rest stay here in prison, so I can see if you're telling me the truth. So he put them all in prison for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph says, again, let one of your brothers stay here. The rest of you can go. You can carry the grain that you bought, but you need to bring your youngest brother back to me. If not, the one that's left here will die. And so, as they're talking about themselves, Joseph understood them. They didn't realize this because Joseph had been using an interpreter. But he understood them. And so Simeon was stayed behind in jail. And as their bags were being filled with the grain, he he put the money back into their bags without telling them. So when they got to when they were traveling and they stopped to feed the donkeys who's carrying all this grain, you know, they open the sack up and they see, oh no, my money's back here. They're like, what happened? What is this? What has God done to us? So when they get to Jacob, they tell him everything that happened, and that Simeon was back there. When they saw the money, they were worried. What does this mean? Is he going to say that we stole this? And so they go back again. And after they had eaten up all the grain that they had bought, they go back to Egypt. This time, they bring Benjamin. And they show up. And then when they show up, Joseph tells the steward of the house, he says, bring all those guys back into the house and we'll have a meal. We'll have a feast. Now, they were a little bit sketchy. They were like, what's going on here? Why is he having a feast with us? What's going to happen? Is it because of the money? Is he going to try to trick us? Make us slaves? And they had the feast. And then he again, as they get ready to leave, this time he tells his steward, you know, again, put the money back in the sacks, but put my cup, the silver cup, in the top of the sack of the youngest. And when they had gone a short distance on their way home, Joseph sent them back and sent the steward after them to overtake them and then open up the sack and find the silver cup and say, why have you done this? You know, arrest the man whose sack it's in, which happens to be Benjamin's. So he did this. And they brought it back. They all came back. And then Judah steps up. Judah, the one that had first talked about killing Joseph and the one that ended up with the plan to sell him into slavery. He steps up and he says, and he pleads for Benjamin's life. He says, we have a father, we have an old man, and Benjamin is the child of his old age. His other brother is dead. He is the lone is left of his mother's children. And his dad loves him. And he pleads for his life, saying that he'll kill his dad to go back without Benjamin, to tell them that Benjamin has been arrested. And Joseph, hearing this, he sends out all his servants away. And he begins to cry. And then he looks at his brothers and he says, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? They were shocked. They were surprised. They didn't know what to say. He told his brothers, he says, come closer. He says, I am your brother. I am Joseph. I am the one that you sold into slavery. Do not be distressed. Do not be angry. He says, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve your life. There's going to be another 5 years of famine. God sent me here to prepare a place for you. So you didn't do anything wrong. It was all part of God's plan. He says, go and bring my father back. All his household. Bring him back. And he went and he told Pharaoh, about his brothers and his dad. And Pharaoh said, of course, bring him here, because he was so pleased with what Joseph had done. And they set him up in the north in a place called Goshen, which was at the headwaters of the Nile, up near the Mediterranean. And it was there they stayed. There was like really rich ground for grazing sheep and goats and cattle. And that's where they stayed. And that's where Jacob came. And eventually Jacob, as he's dying, he blesses Joseph's sons, and he says his last words. He says, and he gives them all a blessing. But he said, take my bones and bury me, with where my father Isaac is buried, where my mother is buried, where Abraham and Sarah are buried. And so they do make that trip with Jacob. And so when the book of Genesis comes to an end, it comes, it says, Joseph remained in Egypt along with his father's household. Joseph lived to be 110. He says to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. When that happens, carry my bones from here. And he died, and as the practice of the Egyptians, he was embalmed and mummified. But then that ends his story. And the Israelites stayed there beyond the years of the famine, because they were being treated good. They were given this beautiful place to stay and to raise their families because of what Joseph had done in the service of the Pharaoh. And they stayed there, and they multiplied, and they grew. And eventually, a couple hundred years go by, and we're going to get to the story of Moses. And as they grew and they multiply, it was forgotten what Joseph did. A new regime took place in Egypt, and they didn't like these foreigners that were living on their northern border. And so they came up with a plan to enslave them and to force them into hard labor. That's the next story. That's where Moses comes in. There's 400 years in between Joseph and Moses. But we stop here. We got to Egypt. We'll pick up the tale of Moses, and we will leave Egypt. We will hear the story of Passover. And we'll hear the story, because that is what Jesus was celebrating, and that was what was happening when Jesus was crucified. It begins here. So there is a lot there. A lot there. And I know I've been talking for a long time. I want you to think, if you have brothers and sisters, And I know if you do, you fight, you squabble, you argue. Maybe not to the point where you want to kill one of your brothers or sisters or sell them into slavery. Or if you do, it's only for a short little time. What do you think about that? You know, Joseph says, you know, you did it, but it's not your fault. Part of God's plan. Now, I would interpret that a little differently. I would say God was able to use Joseph to fulfill his promise to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. Probably didn't want to do it this way, but it happens. Stuff happens. And that's what happens in our life. Stuff happens. Things happen. Things go bad. Things go wrong. Things go good. Things go great. God is there in it all. And God is able to use those times to let us know of his love, his great love for us, and of the promise that we received. 400 years go by between Joseph and Moses. But God does not forget the promise that the people of Israel will live in the land of Canaan. And eventually they do. God keeps God's promises. And the promise that God made to us that we hear at our baptism is that we too are promised to live in a promised land. A land flowing with milk and honey. But this land is with God. So we can trust as we look through the stories of the Old Testament and we look at how God keeps God's promise to Abraham, and through Abraham blesses the rest of the world as it says in the Bible. We can trust that God will keep the promise that we too will live in a promised land. So again, thank you. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening to this. There's a second part to this, the part of Moses. This has been long enough for now. Take a little break, come back to Moses. But hopefully I get to see you again next week at church. Until then, have a blessed week. Or have a blessed break in between Joseph and Moses. Talk to you later.